My name's Hannah Davis and I'm an arts project manager at Book Trust. Book Trust is a reading charity that manages a whole portfolio of literary prizes, and we're very proud that the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize is one of those. The prize was launched back in 1990 with a brief break between 95 and 2000 when it was then revived by the Arts Council. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them and the Independent for their continued commitment to this prize. The prize is awarded annually to the best work of fiction in translation, with the winning author and translator sharing the £10,000 prize. We're here today to discuss the 6 fantastic books that have been shortlisted, and they were announced this morning, which you might have already seen, and you can see the books out here. And I'm going to hand over to our chair, who's Boyd Tonkin. He's a senior writer and columnist at The Independent and a long-standing judge of the prize and considered an expert in translative fiction. He'll introduce you to his fellow panellists, and they're going to talk through the list. There'll be a short 10-minute Q&A at the end, so you'll get to ask some questions then. And if at the end you'd like any of our bookmarks or booklets, which are hot off the press, they're just on the stand at the back, so please do help yourself. Over to you, Boyd.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for coming this afternoon. We have a fantastic list of shortlisted books to discuss, and I'm very, very glad that with me to talk about them are on my right, Ala Vadil, writer, artist, teacher, many other things, and on my left, Sean Whiteside, an incredibly prolific multilingual translator from more languages than I can remember, I think. So anyway, this is the time to talk about other people's translations and other people's fiction. And this year we had the biggest ever submission of titles for the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. It was 126, I think, which is kind of up at Booker Prize levels, which of course makes it both more difficult for us, but also in a way more encouraging, because it shows that translated fiction in general is thriving, that there are more publishers, large and small, prepared to back it, to support it, to promote it. And I think in particular, it shows that the remarkable startups in publishing over the past few years, people who have come along often on quite a small scale, but equally often with a very strong commitment to international literature, have been making a difference in terms of the diversity of the publishing landscape. So although it means more work for us, it's actually excellent news that we had so many titles to consider this year. So it was hard enough getting down to a long list. Then we had a real kind of Game of Thrones battle royal in order to turn the 15 books we had on the long list into 6. It's always like this. It wasn't especially acrimonious. It's just that when you're left with the best of the best, and you then have to winnow it down further, inevitably there are sacrifices, there are losses, there are fantastic books that somehow don't progress. So anyway, this is finally the list that we came up with. And I'm going to read it simply in order of alphabetical order by surname. So we have The Iraqi Christ by Hassan Blasim, translated from the Arabic by Jonathan Wright and published by Comma Press. Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami, translated by Alison Markin Powell from the Japanese, published by Portobello Books. A Man in Love by Karl Ove Knausgaard, translated by Don Bartlett from the Norwegian and published by Harvill Secker. A Meal in Winter by Hubert Mingarelli, translated by Sam Taylor from French, published by Portobello Books. Revenge by Yoko Ogawa, translated by Stephen Snyder from Japanese and published by Harvel Secker. And the sixth is The Mussel Feast by Birgit van der Beker, translated by Jamie Bullock from German and published by Parini Press. So we have 6 fantastic books, really covering an extraordinary range of both of culture, of language, and also form. You noticed I said books rather than novels because we have 2 collections of short stories among them. And I wanted to start by asking our 2 panelists here. I talked about the general increase in the number of the books that we had to consider. How much of an ordeal was it, and how much of a pleasure was it? Aleph.
My house looks like a used book depository. It was a total pleasure. I'm a book bulimic, so what better than to have a very good reason to do nothing but stay in bed for several weeks when the days are short and read and read and read and read. It was an absolute pleasure, and even though I am familiar with literature in translation and always asking for more, I was impressed by the range. There were things that would not have been on my radar otherwise, and it was a real pleasure.
Sean, as a professional translator, did it hearten and encourage you as to the state of the art in English?
It certainly did. I couldn't believe that there are quite so many fantastic translators out there, and the extraordinary range. I think we had 30 languages, is that right?
Yes.
30 languages, all kinds of different sorts of literature, from thrillers to really quite arcane, recondite, poetic novels. There is an extraordinary amount of fascinating work going on out there, and I was also hugely impressed by the number of publishers that are willing to take a risk on what might seem like a very uncommercial proposition often, because many of these would have seemed quite obscure. It was a privilege, because these are books I wouldn't necessarily have come across in the normal run of things.
Aleb, were there any particular surprises and discoveries for you, either in terms of individual writers or of maybe general areas, cultures and languages that you were finding out about?
I was surprised by a resurgence in Latin American literature. We had a lot, way before we even got to the long list, but there was a lot there bubbling away, in popular fiction as well. But I was really blown away by Sinan Antun, particularly, who with The Corpse Washer. So that for me was a huge discovery. I hadn't read him before, although he is an experienced writer. But so, especially and Blassim's Iraqi Christ. So that take on Iraq particularly brought back to me why literature in translation is so vital, because we get to see this other point of view, which we're constantly bombarded with images and cliches about war and crisis, and yet to see these in this close-up human way and to feel an unmediated relation to people in that situation was amazing for me.
Sean, what about you? Were you blown away by anything, any writer, any kind of fiction that you hadn't really come across before?
It was, I think, the Middle Eastern fiction. The South American fiction is very exciting. There's obviously a lot of interesting stuff going on there. But I think it's not just the testimony from the Middle East, it's the way people are experimenting with form and introducing autobiographical ideas, but not writing simply autobiographical stories.
Absolutely.
And I've, in the past, often been concerned that perhaps the novel as such was a Western tradition that we'd somehow imposed on other cultures. But actually I think it's developing in different ways. It's developing different voices. The one Indian book that I read, I was very interested in as well.
The girl with the golden parasol.
Girl with the
Prakash,
that one.
yes.
That was very interesting.
Yes,
I hadn't come across anything that was actually written in Hindi, I think, before. But no, that was fascinating.
Yeah. I suppose that takes us on to the big question about the form of fiction, because as we said, this isn't a prize just for novels. We have 2 story collections, and as you will see, simply by casting an eye on our shortlist, we have one absolutely hulking great monster and 5 much, much slimmer volumes, but each of the slimmer volumes is also different in its own way. And for me, this is part of the kind of global voyage of discovery, because it tells you in how many different ways it's possible to excel as a writer of fiction. And in all the 6 books we have here, and many on our long list as well, hardly any of them conform to the pattern of a completely conventional 250 or 300 page domestic realistic narrative. I mean, that's not to say that that's not a perfectly fine thing to do. It's just that we found authors branching off in so many different directions and using their imagination in such a variety of different ways. Did that correspond to your experience of reading?
Oh, so much so. And I must admit, I do find the standard novel a bit tiring now. I mean, we should be pushing at boundaries. And of the shortlist, Revenge I found particularly remarkable because it is a collection of short stories, but the short stories are really tightly interwoven. And it takes you actually 3 reads to really understand that you've then read a novel. Because every character is related to a scene, rather like that the filmmaker Inarritu, but in a much more involved way than that. And because she's using fiction, you don't know whose eyes you're seeing through when it says I, and you wonder, and now am I the torturer, am I the abandoned wife, am I the disappearing author? So I found that one particularly formally arresting.
Yes. Sean, were there any particular formal discoveries from the shortlist?
Definitely. Certainly Revenge, which was a real eye-opener. That is, minor characters, people you've just glimpsed, then reappear as first-person narrators. But also there's the Knausgård phenomenon. It's not like... It's not really like anything else. It's not... It's not Proust, it's a different thing. And what was fascinating about that book for me was, as I was reading, I was thinking, yes, I've done loads of these things too. I've walked around carrying a baby thinking, what sort of guy am I being at the moment? I've been to children's parties that certainly seemed as if they went on for 36 pages. But also thinking, why am I still reading? This is just a guy's life. Nothing particular has happened in it. And I'm now on page 453. It's an extraordinary thing.
And a glimpse into the male mind. I mean, it might not be Proust, but Proust never got lost in IKEA. So.
Did you... We've talked about the fantastic riches and the depth of the field that we had to consider. Did you miss anything? Did you feel that there was some kinds of voice, some kinds of culture that you weren't experiencing through our submission as a whole this year?
Well, there wasn't any... I didn't get anything Turkish. Just to speak as a Turkish reader in particular. I didn't feel it was representative of the globe. It was representative of the harvest of this year. So, yes, in lots of ways there was so much missing. But that's only because I'm hungry for so much more. I mean, I'd like to read some Azeri fiction. I'd like to read even more Chinese fiction. There's so much more that... But that ought to have been translated. You mean I didn't really have a sense of that.
Sean, were there kind of gaps on the map, either geographically or culturally, for you?
Nothing that particularly struck me, I'd have to say, no. But I found I wasn't missing particularly the traditional English social comedy, because there weren't many books of that kind. No, I wasn't aware of gaps, but yes, possibly Greek and Turkish, possibly around about there.
Yes.
There wasn't very much.
Yeah, there weren't many Greek entries either.
For me, and this is the case every year, there always isn't enough from India and Pakistan written in languages other than English. But then that's a perennial problem for our publishing industry here, and what you do to address it, I have no idea. At least, as we've said, we did have a Hindi translation, Uday Prakash, and so I hope there'll be many more to come in future submissions. Now, another question that arises, of course, the wonderful thing about this prize, and it's still unique, is that it is absolutely an equal split between the writer and the translator. They each gets £5,000, so it's a prize for a great translation of a great work of fiction with an absolutely equal emphasis on both sides of the scales. Anna, how far were you reading, or did you find yourself reading, for the quality of the translation?
I think the quality of the translation is absolutely indivisible from the quality of the book. I mean, what happens is, if a book's bad, we always blame the translator. If we can read in more than one language, we know really it isn't always the messenger's fault. But the translator can bring added magic. That's without doubt too. But all of these books are beautifully translated. We did have some books, I don't know if I'm being indiscreet in saying, we did have some books that were really good, but someone would notice, there was some messiness. And so it really was about the excellence of the translation as well. But it's rather like a symphony. If everyone's at their best, it's wonderful. If there's some grit in there, it doesn't work. But the translations here are fantastic. I was particularly impressed with the Japanese translations, since I'm a keen reader of Japanese literature in translation and have no Japanese, and have read plenty of things that I know I've enjoyed despite the translation. And in this instance, that's not the case, that we're really carried along by the translation. Absolutely mesmerizing.
Sean, again, reading with the eye of a professional translator, were there particular strengths that you discovered? And again, were there any shortcomings that you noticed?
Not shortcomings that I can think of particularly. I think certainly with all these books, the translators have done a fantastic job in capturing different voices. Just absolutely beautiful. I think sometimes it's possible for the translation to be slightly better than the book.
It is.
That is, you think this is a dazzling piece of pyrotechnics, but the plot didn't quite carry through. But I think here we've got a perfect blend of some really excellent translations and some really excellent writers, which is what you're aiming for.
It was Umberto Eco who said that The Name of the Rose by William Weaver was a better book than The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. Which is kind of difficult for us because we do have to honour the original as seriously. But I think that each one of the 6 translations here is quite a dazzling performance. And I think because it is such a conspicuous standout event this year, I think we do need to say a little more about the fact that we've ended up with two short Japanese books on the shortlist. And we certainly didn't plan it that way. There was no backhander from the Japanese embassy. And so what was it about these supremely gifted Japanese women writers?
They were just so fresh and exciting. Perhaps you can guess I'm a strong advocate for both books. The formal pyrotechnics, but also the very strangeness of revenge. We were talking about, and we were trying to think of English parallels, and the strangest things like, Roald Dahl and sort of surrealism, and so it's dark, but it's also light. It's very strange. This is a very gentle novel, a very light novel, and some juries might really miss it because they want big, heavy, masculine fiction, although I did love the phallic fiction. But this has a wonderful afterlife, an emotional afterlife, and it's a light novel about love, but how difficult to write with lightness and with holding sentimentality and yet leaving you really moved. So the cover's a little misleading because it's not all that surrealist. It's not sort of girls flying around in the air. That's more revenge. But as to a wider phenomenon of why Japan, I mean, neither book is super new, but maybe Japan was very much in our minds. I don't know, but only subconsciously. It was just that didn't we fall in love with these two
Certainly did.
fresh, strange novel?
So, Sean, was there a particular Japanese-ness on show here, or are we looking too hard for a kind of stereotypical quality?
I don't think you had to look for it at all. They both have lightness and poise and delicacy, and a certain plainness as well. They're not overwritten at all.
And some very odd things happen.
And some very odd things happen in both. Yes. So I think it's that.
They happen in life.
Pardon?
Yes.
Happen in life too.
Yes. That's. Another thing that I wanted to mention is the way that reading international fiction often shows me that you can write about absolutely massive themes, but you can do so in quite unexpected and often quite delicate ways. If, for instance, we take Hubert Mingarelli, Emile in Winter, which is, in a way, it's a kind of Holocaust novel, but it's not set in a camp. It's set in the forests of Poland, where the massacres, the killings are much more sort of sporadic and almost, well, not unplanned, but dispersed and decentralized. And again, it's something that takes the worst theme, the most tragic theme, and treats it with huge delicacy and obliqueness, really. And this was a quality I valued enormously in many of the books we read, and I think it's maybe a quality that writers here ought to study a bit more. Alev, would you agree?
I thought The Mussel Feast was also very understated and oblique, and it's a family situation, it's preparing a meal, and yet there's a tremendous sense of menace. Nothing happens, everything happens as this meal is prepared. The whole family situation and the sort of patriarchal figure and the father and his problems, it's all so understated and it's all there. And this also becomes a kind of larger metaphor for the trauma and aftermath of war. But again, I felt that was very economically and obliquely done. And I believe her debut novel, I mean, she's a very famous writer now, but her debut novel? I think so, which if it is, it's like a bloody miracle. It's an amazing book.
Yeah.
But she's now very famous. It was written in 1990. It's taken us a long time to get it in English.
Yes, that raises another interesting question, that when we're judging this prize, it's not only a sort of fantastic experience of traveling the world, but also, as Alev mentioned, we're also traveling in time, because often translations reach us with such an incredible delay. So The Mussel Feast, which is kind of fantastically fresh and lively and contemporary, but it is more than 20 years old. I mean, everyone in British publishing knows that it's only sometimes when a book has been successful in another big European market that it's then translated into English. So we do have the kind of strange time lag in judging this prize. Does that matter, Sean?
I don't think so. I think it
That's-
was fascinating that, in fact, it's the 3 books by women, unless I'm making a mistake, that have taken a while to reach
Yes.
us.
Yeah.
Both the Japanese books were published a while ago as well. But no, they seemed absolutely fresh and new to me. No, nothing dusty there at all.
I suppose it also proves that we're less liable to be, as it were, distracted by a headline theme or something that's an obviously fashionable topic, because we simply don't have that option. So we're looking for the qualities that will last.
I think so. And the Nausgaard made it despite its, fashionable acclaim rather than because.
Yes.
I mean, good writing lasts. That's the whole point. It's not supposed to have a shelf life and a hook. It's not journalism. Although it is news from a moment. And even if it's from 1990, it does feel like news, doesn't it? They really do give us a fresh insight into a situation.
And certainly that's true of the Blaspheme.
Yes,
which is incredibly contemporary, I think.
It is. For me, it was extraordinary reading Hassan Blassim and also Sinan Antoun on our long list, which is The Corpse Watcher, which is a book I would also very strongly recommend. It's curious. We've heard so much from Iraq in the last 11 years, and yet when it comes to the experience which is recounted and reflected upon here, we seem to have heard nothing. Do you think that's...
Absolutely, such a fresh vision. Quite a lot of surrealism going on there, but not in a magic realist, not in a way that hides things, but rather brings them to the fore. And then lots and lots of different ways of telling going on in these stories. And then they seem totally different, but they have an autobiographical link. And it's about Iraq. It's also a diaspora novel because we see him move. So it has a sense of being decentered. Very modern. It felt really modern. So it's not just about the themes. It's the form there as well, like the form with revenge. Some really bold experiments, which is what I was looking for.
Yeah, it was like watching forms being invented.
That's that. And we mentioned that although it's not a memoir, there are elements of Hassan Blassim's life in these stories. And, of course, overwhelmingly, we have this issue with the Knausgaard, where we've had some people discussing Knausgaard saying, well, can you judge it as fiction? Because clearly it does follow the outlines of his life relatively closely. The same people who are important in his life are also important in the books. It is him. There's no real attempt to create a completely separate fictional persona. And yet for me, it is... I mean, all that is hearsay. I mean, as we were saying, as far as we know, Carlo Knausgaard might be a Middle Western housewife living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We have to judge the words on the page and only the words on the page, and they have to survive as an imaginative artifact in their own right. Do you think that's the case?
Absolutely,
Sure.
yes. I actually recognised one of the characters in it, so definitely. If he's written it as fiction, then it's fiction. Well, even if it all really happened, it's still fiction.
So absolutely true, and it's so long, and he is actually chronicling, turning his life into fiction anyway. I mean, does Knausgaard really exist outside of writing? Yes. And the crisis of that is fictively presented. It's about a person disappearing into fiction, really.
Yeah. That's. And summing up the whole experience, has it made you optimistic about the future of fiction in translation in this country? Has it sort of stiffened your sinews and made you more hopeful about the welcome that we give to translation here?
It's made me feel hugely optimistic. It was a little literary Prozac for me. Getting you know, boxes and boxes of free books, and they kept saying, you don't have to read all of them. I kept saying, send them all, all 156, I will read them. And also, actually, as a jury, I mean, I had imagined literary juries have all sorts of guidelines, and they have to find the most readable things, and they have to do things for the publishing industry. And this was a really amazing experience in that it was really about how we felt and what we loved. So the whole experience and the whole cartloads of books definitely filled me with optimism. Although also, I mean, to have a care for these amazing publishers who make these amazing objects out of the words as well, and do all that work, and that we must support them, and we must go out and buy more of their books.
Yeah. Sean, translation is in a way your bread and butter, but was there any new dimension that came with this, as it were, mass immersion?
Just a renewal of respect for the people who carry out my trade, I think, really. I found it hugely encouraging just to see how many people are doing how many different and exciting kinds of thing. And I think it's in the air at the moment that we used to be a quiet mole-like kind of bunch of people who hid away in libraries, but it's completely changed over the last few years. I think it's brilliant.
Well, thank you. And we have some time for questions, comments now, so if you would like to ask anything, then please do.
Thank you, Geraldine Rose from Peak Platform. It's a comment, really. One comment that you made about not many Indian translations, and this is very true. Of course, all the Indian translations that we've all heard of and they're not actually translations, the Indian writers, they've been written actually in English in the first place. So it's not just submissions for this fiction prize, but generally there isn't much that's in translation of Indian languages. And actually one of our imprints is Cadaloo, and that is exactly what we're trying to do to redress this issue. That we're now we're acting as agents, as well as we're publishers also, but acting as agents for Indian language writers and translating them into English. So it was just a comment, but you're quite right. There is a shortage. Thank you.
And could I, sorry, this looks as if it was a plant, but it's not. In my bag, I have, I mean, he's not eligible for this prize because he's long dead, but the wonderful Urdu short story writer Sadat Mantu, Bombay Stories, published this month as a vintage classic. So although it's not a living writer, well done to Vintage for at least doing that, and I hope they do many other things. That's fantastic. Do we have another question? Yes, that's.
Hi, Nick Bottomley. I run an independent bookshop in Bath, and we spend most of our time seeking out translated novels, or also American novels that we can champion that other people aren't paying enough attention to. So I wonder, and you may not be able to answer this question, whether each of you could tell me one other book that wasn't on the shortlist that you think we should go out and read and tell all our customers about.
Well, I mentioned Sinan Antoon's The Corpse Washer earlier, which I really highly recommend. But another one I'd like to recommend, which was Syed Kashua's Exposure. Yes. Now, that's a thriller, but it's got some really deep themes about the double going on. So it's really readable. It's for everybody. But it's also doing some very clever things around identity and form. And it's also giving you a portrait of Arab Israelis. And I really didn't know any of the whole kind of social class issues, identity issues around being an Arab Israeli. And it was a really light, readable, fun crime novel, but it was also taking me to whole new headspaces, and I so recommend it.
Sean.
I like the Icelandic book, The Sorrow of Angels.
Oh, I love that too.
Which was really terrific and not like really anything else that I've read. It's a sort of wind-lashed, rain-lashed saga set in, I think, the 19th century. It's a lovely thing.
That's Jon Kalman Stefansson. Yes. And if I could just recommend The Dark Road by Ma Jian, terrific Chinese writer in exile here in London, shortlisted before for this prize for Beijing Coma. And The Dark Road, it's as if Dickens or Victor Hugo had come back to today's China. It's the story of a family who are on the run from the one-child policy through this landscape which is kind of being harrowed and transformed by rapid industrialization. And I think it's one of those books that in the future people will look back and say, well, what was it like to live in China going through this extraordinary, breakneck, uncontrolled development, and yet still under the control of a quite vicious one-party state. And I think it's something like The Dark Road will tell you precisely how it felt. Is there another question?
Hi, Christina McSweeney, translator. This is not so much a question, just to say I was involved this year with the Writer Centre's Norwich reading panel to choose 8 books for their summer reads. And I'm really happy to say that there are 3 books on this list that we really argued and thought over, and most of us loved. And it was really nice just to see them there. So I think readers are going to love this choice.
Which of them?
Strange News from Tokyo, The Muscle Feast, and The Iraqi Cries.
Right.
And as we were,
Yeah.
we weren't translated literature. It was literature in general.
Yeah.
It's good to see them there.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, obviously, we go around evangelizing for translated literature, but it's also very, very important to tell readers that these are just great books, and it's not having one of your 5 a day or 7 a day to read a book in translation. It's just fun and enjoyable, and when you're in the hands of a really expert translator, it's an enormous pleasure, and I think we should never lose sight of that facet too. Is there another question?
Rose Fenton from the Free Word Centre. You've all talked about how many of these novels have been experimenting with form, and you said that at one point there was a fear that perhaps there was could have been too much engaging with a kind of Western canon, but no, not at all. And so as well as the walking in other worlds that you get with reading these novels, experimenting with form, do you think that some of these experimentations could have an impact on the way writers may approach storytelling, writing novels in Britain?
I think that's a wonderful question, because I really think that's what it's there for. Yes, I found it tremendously inspiring, and I do think it will have. I think also this being drawn to the small form, whether they're written now, there seems to be something very contemporary about. Maybe because we all write poetry, but nobody reads poetry anymore. Maybe we need our prose to be more poetic, because a lot of this writing is like poetry. It's like whiskey rather than beer. It's carefully constructed and it knocks you out.
Sure. Would you agree?
I think the short forms are they are part of the zeitgeist at the moment, with Lydia Davis and George Saunders. Yeah. As far as the short stories are concerned, but yes. I think the experimentation with form is one of the very best reasons for reading works in translation, because they bring something new, which you may be able to use yourself as a reader, but they certainly break up a tradition. They give you a new way of looking at things, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe the Japanese was particularly that discipline and that poetic thing they brought to it. Yeah. Thank you, Rose.
Yeah. Well, as I know from a few unwise evenings, it's perfectly possible to have beer with a whiskey chaser. That's although not always advisable. So I mean, I like shifting between the large and the small scale, but I think in terms of the priorities for fiction in this country, we do need to cherish and emphasize and nurture the shorter forms. And it is maybe one of the answers to the question what fiction is for when we're surrounded by stories of so many kinds in so many different platforms and media. And the shorter forms of fiction, the novella, the short stories, the collections of stories, allow us to really to prioritize quality over quantity. And in a time when people need more answers and new answers as to why they should be reading fiction rather than experiencing some other form of media, I think that's as good as any. Would you? Yes. Yeah.
I think that's so true.
Yeah,
Definitely.
and we should wrap up soon, but maybe if we have time for just one more question, if anyone wants to ask.
Yes, I'm an Iraqi linguist, so no prizes for guessing which book I'm interested in more than the others. Because I'm also writing a review for some local press. You mentioned this is short list of 6 out of how many books was it?
126.
126. Okay, thanks very much. Is there anything else you can tell me about the Iraqi Christ?
Well, only...
Or later on when...
Only it is the most extraordinary insight into a world which has been destroyed by war, and of course by dictatorship leading to war. So it's I think it's about surviving as a human being when so many forces are stacked against your humanity.
I would say that I don't read in Arabic or Iraqi, but I would say that my experience of Arab poetry and fiction in translation is that it often tends towards abstraction and can be very difficult to translate and read in a Western way. I would say that Blasim is doing something very new. I'm guessing, I haven't read it in the original, but I'm guessing he's doing something very new with Arab forms as well, while we are seeing lots of those motifs, the jinn, lots of references to poetry, but we're also getting something where he puts the abstract in with the concrete, the surreal with the documentary. So it's very fresh writing, whether you're looking from an Iraqi perspective or a British perspective or an Inuit perspective.
Some of the other books are perhaps a little bit quiet. They're little chamber pieces. They're quite, the Mussel Feast, for example, very quiet. The Blasim is like an explosion in comparison. It's very percussive.
Yeah. Well, I would love to go on, but it's now 4:15. I hope we've whetted your appetite for these books. I hope you read them all. If you don't like them, then go to the long list and you'll find 9 other fantastic books. If you don't like the long list, then check the total number of submissions, and I'm sure there'll be something that you will love. Anyway, we now have to wait until the 22nd of May when the winner is announced. And in the meantime, I hope that you will all get to enjoy as many of these books as possible. So thank you very much for coming. That's